Welcome everyone to our final 2021 spring core conversation. It has been so much fun to meet with you all a few times a semester this year and to have these conversations with our board members. And this is just a marvelous way to conclude the series for the year, I think. I am Charlie Thomas. I'm the executive director of ACTC, who sponsors these core conversations. ACTC is an international professional association for people who teach core texts, which we define loosely, works of cultural significance and world classics. Our conference is coming up online. The proposal deadline is passed, but there's still plenty of time to register. So if you're interested in talking to us and others at ACTC about books that you love and teaching them, we would love to have you. The information is on our website at coretext.org. But I am going to stop there and hand this to Molly in a second. Let me just give you a couple of instructions before we get started. It's a big enough group that we probably should mute ourselves when we're not speaking. We can see how it goes to unmute and be more casual about jumping into conversation, but with a group this size, sometimes that creates problems with audio. So let's start by, if you're not speaking, having yourself muted. Also, it's completely fine to keep your camera off and just be in the margins of this conversation. But if you are going to ask a question, it's better for you to turn your camera on so we can see you when you ask your question. If you want to get into the conversation, you can just, wave, and I will try to keep my eyes open for whatever, sort of be an auctioneer and keep my eyes open for whatever gesture suggests to me that you are having trouble breaking in. But you can also use the Zoom raise hand function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. One of the options in the sort of row of buttons is reactions. And if you click on reactions, the whole bottom of the window that opens up is a raise hand function. So that'll be a clear sign to me that you'd like to say something, and I will make sure to get you into the conversation. So I'm going to turn this over to Molly McGrath. Molly is a professor of philosophy and director of the honors program at Assumption University and a member of the board of directors of ACTC. And let me just say, I just loved your recorded remarks on Freud, and I'm really looking forward to talking with you more about it today. So it's all yours, Molly.
Thank you, Charlie, and thank you everyone for being here. Thank you especially to Charlie for doing so much with ACTC this year and sponsoring these conversations. So I don't have a whole lot more to say other than what was said in the kind of the initial part of this, the recording. I think that, well, first of all, I'm not an expert. It's a very ACTC thing for me to do because I'm not an expert on Freud, and it probably you all have questions about Freud, like I have questions about Freud that I just can't answer. And so we can, ask them. And if anyone in the room knows, that's great. But I'm not an expert on Freud. I'm teaching him as an undergraduate teacher, teaching undergraduates, something that I think that they should think through. And I like teaching it because it's a very conversable text with other texts, So he doesn't mention Mill, for example, but he's clearly operating in chapter 2 with a Millian definition of happiness. He doesn't mention Emerson, but I think that the people that he does mention about, this oceanic feeling and the narcissism of feeling like you're connected with the entire universe and God and that kind of thing, I think that he can be connected with Emerson very well there. And so I think that it's a good core text because it can connect to other texts, but also because the issues that he addresses, I think, are really good for students, especially today, perhaps. I think that our students are inundated with this idea that they're supposed to be true to themselves. And I think that Freud draws a picture of the human being in which that question or that command doesn't even make sense. Like, which part are you supposed to be true to quote The Incredibles. Like people keep telling me to be true to myself, Incrediboy says, but they won't tell me which part to be true to. And when you read Freud, that really, like, am I supposed to be true to the superego, the ego, or the id? It no longer makes as clear sense to them. And it's not that I want to destroy the idea that they should be true to themselves. It seems to me like there's some truth in it. It's that I don't want them to think that it's obvious what that means. And I think that Freud helps there, plus to be a little less naive about ourselves, and also to kind of understand when things erupt in public life or in culture or something like that, that there are forces at work in human nature. And I think he helps us understand those things. So that's what I'm after teaching it. In general, it's placed in a class, with Emerson, Mill, Kant, Thomas Aquinas, Aristotle, and I do a bunch of little essays on conscience too, which Freud fits in with because I think he has a theory of conscience, and I don't think it's a very deep one. So I put him next to a couple better theories, I think. So that's how it fits into my life. And I look forward to what hopefully will become just a nice conversation today. That is to say, I may not be able to answer your questions.
Michael, please jump in. We can't hear you yet, though.
There you go. Hi, Molly. Nice to see you again, and thank you very much for the talk. My question comes out of forgetfulness, having been a long time since I read this text, and maybe a little slip of attention during your talk. I wondered about the relationship of aggression to the death impulse or drive or whatever it's called. Are they different things? Are they related to one another? I seem to remember you were talking about aggression in one chapter, and then the Thanatos drive didn't come up till the next chapter, but I may have missed a connection.
So I'm, again, not an expert on Freud. The way I read this book is that that the death drive is somehow a hypothesis that explains a kind of primal aggressiveness. And so I think it's a matter of hypothesis and then symptom. So for him, the death drive is a hypothesis, and I guess he had to talk himself into it for a while, like he wasn't sure about it. But then he kind of became convinced of it, that there is something fundamental human beings, and that aggressiveness, destructiveness, those things are just symptoms of it. That's my reading of this text.
I thought it was interesting that, Paige, you're next. I thought it was really interesting that you tied that to the context, right? That Freud was sort of reeling from World War I, and I wonder, again, know that you're not an expert, but I wonder if you find that coming out in other ways. That is, this makes sense that if you feel like the world has kind of the orderliness of the world that perhaps you thought was perhaps not fixed but reliable has now kind of dissolved, and you find yourself looking for new patterns to make sense of the human condition because the old ones seem to be casualties of World War I. I wonder if that comes out in other ways in Freud too. I wonder when you talk about that with your students, whether they seize on that kind of thought that it matters that Freud is writing between the two wars, and that his view of human nature is somehow conditioned by that. And I also wonder, I'm just, I'm not a sociologist. I try not to make grand sweeping judgments about my students or the times, but I do wonder sometimes whether there's a kind of way in which the world is less, and I sound like an old person now, but is sort of less orderly for them than I thought it was when I was their age, and whether that kind of that Freudian sense that we have to look elsewhere to make sense of human nature, especially in the context of a world where conventions have all kind of broken down. I wonder how that that resonates with them, whether they whether they are interested, whether they want to jump on board with the death instinct or not, but whether they're interested in finding these other ways of making sense of human being, and perhaps for similar reasons, because their world is not reliable. They don't perceive it to be reliable to them in ways that perhaps once they did.
Well, I'm not an expert on this kind of empirical psychology stuff, but we're all being told incessantly that our students, that the mental health issues are increasing, especially anxiety and depression and those kinds of things. I don't think that's because of anything like an experience of like World War I, which was both massive, world historical, massive in its destruction and in its patent meaninglessness, right? But because this was happening before COVID with our students, right? And then COVID has made it worse in a billion ways for those who already had these kinds of tendencies. So I think that they do feel vulnerable, and they like, as you said, that the world isn't as regular or dependable, maybe, but I don't know if that's because of some kind of disruptive event or whether there's something else going on, changes in the way that they were raised or the way culture is structured that have contributed to it. I'm not sure about that.
Jump in, Paige. You're still muted, sorry.
Similar to what Charlie was saying, I noticed in your talk, Molly, you used the term cultural superego. And I thought, now there's some Jung is going to creep in here. And you never mentioned his name, and no reason you would have to, but I wondered, again, kind of the way Charlie was thinking, when we look at contemporary things. I wasn't thinking so much of Freud's era, but of our own era and what students might be saying. It seems to me that tribalism and gun culture and things like that, really almost seems to be free floating in our culture, in a way that obviously it's attached to us, but there's a sense of, it has a life of its own. The way the term cultural superego might indicate that, or even cultural id, or the Thanatos principle, unhinged from individuals. Do students go in that way, or am I, again, as a literature person, and the only Freud that I've been taught has stuff that relates more directly to literature and dreams and so forth. But is there something there? And do you make the association with tribalism today? What would Freud say if he turned on CNN today?
He would say that there's probably a lot of suppression of homoerotic drives happening through political organizations or something like that, right? Like I think for him, so the students, first question, so do the students go there? I don't think, my students, just different schools have different cultures. My students aren't very pushy politically, right? And so they don't really go there on their own, but I try to suggest it to them that the tribalism, in our culture, what seems to me an increasing tribalism, and sometimes it's like an ethnic tribalism, and sometimes it's an ideological tribalism, or like a where you live. There are all kinds of ways in which people just offer some kind of stupid excuse for liking one group of people more than another group of people. And sometimes it has a really positive angle to it, and it can be harnessed for real good. And then sometimes it has just an absolutely brutal, even murderous, second, side to it. This coming up with reasons to identify a tribe, and I don't think that they go there naturally, but I try to get them to see it that Freud is helping us understand that anything can become an excuse for a group binding together, and anything therefore can also become an excuse for hatred of the people who are not in your bound group, right? And he's clear about that. So I have to kind of point that out to them. I think they get it, you know, but they're not pushy about it. But I do think it helps them. I mean, what we're experiencing is, I think, an increasing tribalism, or, you know, a siloization in which people increasingly do not socialize or talk to people in advance that they know will disagree with them or they don't feel comfortable with, and that kind of thing. So like the bowling leagues, and in which different kinds of people are all bowling together on Saturday or something like that. There's this kind of Hollywood image of, you know, a culture gone by. That image can't even be passed off, you know, today. If it was ever, you know, to whatever extent it was ever fantasy, it can't be passed off today. People don't do that as much. They're really limiting their social interactions more according to those kinds of groupings, and they can be any kind of grouping. And so I'm worried about that, and I kind of want my students to think about it, and about the importance of not, you know, not finding just this is one of the things I like about Freud. It's almost like people are looking for excuses to hate each other, you know, because the reasons they come up with are so bad, you know. And so like when you can just take any random difference between any groups of people and it becomes a reason for real hatred and rage. And I think that, you know, Freud helps the students see that and therefore hopefully not participate in it.
Thank you.
I loved your comments about which part should I be true to. that's great. I'm gonna steal that. And one thing, I teach literary theory pretty frequently, and when I talk about Freud, we always talk about premises, like what's the premise from which this person's coming before we look at their observations and their conclusions. And what your observation there about which part made me think of is Freud's premise is my desires are the foundational principle of who I am, which is a relatively new way of thinking, right? That desire is my authentic self, not something that needs to be put into, not something that could even be controlled. If you try, it'll just create havoc for you. And that the intellect is just at the mercy of this. So, you know, in the Thomistic sense, concupiscence is no longer, you're no longer susceptible to it. You just completely succumb to it. Sometimes I even connect it to Calvin. You know, you're just totally depraved. Your desires rule you, and you're just at the mercy of them. And so when you say, you know, why are we all so angry? Well, all, you know, what we call political discourse, I tell my students, I'm like, this is just people talking about their feelings. And you know, Charlie said, you know, we feel more disordered. I'm like, well, when the feelings are the ground on which all discussion will occur, well, of course you're gonna feel disordered. I feel disordered when I just look to my feelings as my only guide. There's no external mechanism permitted. And this is how Freud operates throughout his career. Like, desire is the center of the human being. And so I love that comment about which part, because it's kind of like which feeling. Well, ask me in 2 minutes and it'll be different. And so, you know, these students, and they feel that to place a desire underneath an intellectual decision is a betrayal of their authentic self, or will hurt them. Shows you how deeply Freud has, although it's not practiced clinically, it's deeply worked itself into our whole kind of psychology of everyday life. And that's something I'm like, that's why we're studying him. Because they'll ask me, like, does anyone actually practice this? And I'm like, formally, no, but you're all doing it and I'm doing it too, because it's in the water so deeply now. So anyway, I'm actually, even though you're kind of saying like, I don't really know this, and I'm actually thinking you really have a great grasp on this. And I love your question, you know, to which part, because to me, it's like to which feeling and to which desire of the moment, and no sense that can be controlled. So.
Yeah, I'm not thoroughly convinced that students have been thoroughly convinced that following their desires, using reason or intelligence to overrule a desire is a betrayal. I think that there's a part of them that thinks that, or that they've been led to believe that. And of course, their desires want to tell them that, right? But at the same time, they're human beings. And I also think that they just do a lot of puzzling, or that they're confused a lot about what it is that they should do. And sometimes people, when they give in to desires of some sort, they do, and Freud's right that this happens. He's not right that this is all that happens. This is all that reason is, but he's right that reason sometimes does this. It comes in with like a ex post facto, very handy rationalization, like a lawyer arguing for whatever you want to be argued for. That's how reason operates in Freud. The students know they do that sometimes. All people do that sometimes. But I think that they're also, I believe in the richness of human nature enough to think that there's also part of our students that, they want to be told that the conscience is not just a rationalizer, because they also experience conscience, and those kinds of experiences are cut more deeply than their desires. They feel it more deeply. And so if you can kind of point out to them that it isn't a betrayal to follow your conscience, even when that means that you do something that you really don't want to do, then I think that resonates with them also. It's just that they're in this kind of confusion of concepts, and they've been told that they have to be true to themselves over and over again. And of course, they have every reason to like being told that.
Josh, jump in.
Yeah, sure. Actually, so 2 points. One sort of a follow-up to the previous one. I would be a little bit reluctant to suggest that our sort of free-floating general emotivism is all traceable to Freud, because I don't think that he's really suggesting that the ego is not important and the superego is not important. On the contrary, without them, there really is no moving forward whatsoever. So, but leaving that aside, I'm just curious about the sort of tactic that you use with the text. That is, I wonder, reading a text in part to pick it apart, does that sometimes backfire? Does it ever lead your students to be sort of hostile in the way in which they tend to read all texts? Part of the point that I have in mind has something to do with the fact that I teach at a university that relies extremely heavily on core texts. I think at institutions that rely so heavily on core texts and have really big programs, they actually tend to have a little bit more of a reverential approach to texts, and they make a big deal about being highly selective and only using the best texts. So I'm just curious, I suspect that other institutions where they have fewer core texts, that there's a little bit less of that desire to be reverential about the texts you choose and to be highly selective and only use the very best. So I'm just curious how the dynamic works at your institution, because at mine, I suspect that it would lead students to be hostile readers, which would be really problematic. So I'm just curious.
So what would lead them to be hostile readers?
Selecting a text largely because it is deficient in one way or another. Another way of putting it would be to observe that this is late Freud and not really particularly good Freud. That is, for people who are sympathetic to Freud, they would not go to this as a sort of touchstone.
Well, I mean, there are different things that Freud is up to. So if you wanted to look at the psychology or something, that this isn't the text that you go to, probably. I think it's an excellent text. I don't choose it to pick it apart. I think it's a fantastic text. I think he's wrong in some ways, and I think he's sometimes silly. But I think it's like really serious and about really serious things. And he's saying things that are, some of the things he says are both true, and they really need to be added into the conversation about what it looks like if you're going to live a good life, or what it looks like if you're going to live a bad life. And that's kind of what I want to put in front of my students, is think concretely about ethics as an attempt to live a good life. And what do you want your life to look like? And he puts some things out there on the table that you don't quite get from reading Mill or reading Kant, or even reading Aristotle, because he's kind of so blunt about them and because it's contemporary. And frankly, he says it in ways that they are more likely to understand. So I'm not at all choosing it to pick it apart. One of the things I like about it is it's kind of like bimodal or something like that. There's greatness in it, and then there's just like silliness in it. And if it was just a bad text, I wouldn't teach it, right? But the fact that it has real brilliance in it, and then it also has some stuff that, you know, you wouldn't want to encourage your students to believe, allows me also to make a kind of meta point. In addition to teaching the content of the text, it allows me to make this meta point, which is that thou shalt not worship any text, right? And also, you can't just throw things out, you know, because someone makes a mistake or they're wrong about one range of things. You know, the human beings are complicated, and getting the truth is difficult. And so we can't just throw people out because they're wrong. So this text in its very like mixture of brilliance and not so brilliant is very useful to me for that meta point.
Yeah. So by the way, though, about the thou shalt not worship any text, in my experience with students, I find that they tend to have very little patience and very little ability to endure in order to understand things that are difficult. I think if anything in our culture, that's among the greatest problems we have with students. So that's really what I was trying to get at. I mean, I still wonder about the tactic of using a text that, as you said, it's a mixture of brilliance and just stupidity or silliness. It just seems like it could contribute to this impatience, unwillingness to read things that are really hard. So that's what I was trying to get at.
I hope that I have time to circle back to this conversation, because I'm very interested in it. But Neil has been very patient on the queue, so please jump in.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing a guest. And so I think in this question, I want to maybe stand up for feelings a little bit, vouch for them in this way, by going back to Aristotle. And in particular, his book on wishing, or the chapter on wishing, and in which he points out that we're oriented, this is my language, my way of paraphrasing it, we're oriented by what we wish for. And some people, virtuous people, he doesn't quite say this in this book, but this is my take, virtuous people wish for what's actually good. Other people, most of us, if not all of us, Aristotle's a pessimist in this sense, wish for just what seems good to them. And it raises this real question between what is actually good and what seems to be good. But the reason I bring this up is speaking up for feelings is that I think there's a way in which with wishing, there can be a link between what one feels and what an intention. That is to say, why does one choose something? Because there are things you can wish for that are beyond your control. Then there are things you can wish for that are within your control. And those are the kinds of things that you choose and should deliberate about. Or And that's, of course, central to the ethics. And so I do think there's a way in which feelings, to put it in those terms, are super important to Aristotle. As he points out, reason by itself moves nothing. And so I think that having feelings and recognizing the importance of feelings is crucial. It's not that feelings should be dismissed. It's that we need to really reflect upon our feelings, or that's my language. But I'm just interested, Molly, in this giving feelings their due, because as I listened to the talk, I felt like maybe feelings weren't getting their due. And there's much to be said for them.
Well, you know how much I love talking about my feelings in public, Neil. Now, so I guess I would rather use the word emotions than feelings here, because they imply a certain kind of structuredness by intentionality. That is to say, sometimes we think of feelings as non-rational, or whereas in fact, I think, especially in the case of emotions, they have a really often very complicated structure, the logical structure. Like to spell out how you feel might require you to take many paragraphs to explain a situation, and then that's the way you'd capture the emotion, right? In other words, it's not just like, you know, you like warm showers or something like that. You know, that it's we have different, very complicated feelings, which I think make them not just non-rational. Like you can have, I think, different ways in which you could say a feeling is rational or not rational. You know, like you could have a feeling that's not movable by reason, that you know is irrational. But the very fact that a feeling could be irrational shows already that it's rational, in the sense that it's structured rationally and that it should be amenable to persuasion by reason, right? So in other words, emotions are not non-rational. So I would first try to like say that I don't want quite the sharp division between feelings and reason. Okay. And secondly, I think that what you're asking brings out a very important difference between Freud and Aristotle. Freud, the drives are, I think, non-rational. They're like, I think of them almost in physical terms, because, you know, he was into kind of brain stuff too. He thought all this had, you know, parts of the brain were doing things. Let's think about hate as just being like a certain kind of liquid secretion in your body, and it's building up, right? As though it's just like another thing in the world. It's not in the realm of reason or intentionality or something like that. It just has a certain kind of epiphenomenal, you know, intentional structure. So I think for him, civilization requires repression of these thingly forces, non-rational thingly forces called feelings. And that the purpose of our lives is set by these drives, right? And that civilization is a kind of rational strategy to actually serve those drives better, but the drives don't like being controlled by reason in that way. And the reason becomes merely a manager, a lawyer, or a pimp, something like that, a hired hand to help the id get what it wants most of all. But then the lawyer constantly has to explain back to the id, like, well, you can't get what you want the way you want it. You know, it'll work better if you wait a week or something like that. And so that's the situation that the ego is in. So for him, civilization is this kind of repression and rechanneling. Whereas I think for Aristotle, instead of repression, what you have is restraint and even a fulfillment or a completion. So in that chapter on wishing in book 3 of the Ethics, right, one of the things he does there is he says that everyone wishes for the true good. Or maybe everyone wishes for what appears to be the true good to them. So what is it that we should say? That everyone wishes for the true good, or that everyone wishes for the parent good? And he basically says something like this, that the good person wishes for the true good, everyone wishes for the merely apparent good, but no one's really wishing for the apparent good, right? There's a kind of depth to the desire, and the real desire is for the true good, right? And so that when someone does something stupid, they do what they want to do, maybe, on a superficial level, but they're not really doing what they want to do. And maybe they'll discover that 20 years later or something like that. Like, that really wasn't what you wanted to do, Molly, you know? So I think for Aristotle, the drives have a certain kind of fulfillment. These desires are fulfilled in the truth, and reason helps them find their higher fulfillment precisely by restraining them or correcting them or thinking, having more insight into how things work, or having more insight into the higher good rather than lower good. And that therefore civilization appears not as merely a repressive force, but as a restraining force that is also allows the true desires to really be achieved, you know, rather than just getting what you seem to want at the moment. That's anyway, I should stop talking.
If I can follow up just briefly with a contrast to Freud. I mean, I have no familiarity with Freud whatsoever. But it was an impressive presentation, so it provoked a lot of thought. And I guess one of my thoughts was that for Freud, there's discontent, or what one might call, to use Aristotle's notion of this internal civil war of both the restrained and the unrestrained person, although the unrestrained person maybe feels just mostly regret and less civil war in the moment. But this tension between what reason posits, to use Aristotle language, or what's known to be good, and what's chosen, despite the knowledge of the good, right? There's some way out, right? That's an inner struggle that there's conflict there. It can give rise to regret. But it seems like, I'm curious about how Freud's notion of discontent works there. It seems like civilization is almost like this external force that keeps all of us in, at best, the position of a restrained person. And there's no possibility of any kind of internal harmony whatsoever. Does that seem?
Yeah, I think that there's no, so I would, two different claims. Is virtue a thing? And then does it actually find some kind of, perfect or, instantiation? So I think that Freud not only would say that virtue doesn't exist in Aristotle's sense, I don't think the concept really makes sense in Freud.
Yeah.
That there's no state of character that would be a perfection of the human being such that the fundamental desires of the human being would be aligned with reality. Whereas for Aristotle, he believes in both. I think that virtue is a thing, that the state of mind is conceivable. There's a kind of whatness there, and that also some people get it. And then I guess my quibble would be to what extent there are truly virtuous human beings in the way that Aristotle defines it, especially given his doctrine of the unity of virtues, right? It's a very high standard. And about that stuff in book 7, about types of character, I'll add two other things. One is that why is the godlike virtuous human being there at all? Aristotle doesn't describe him at all. And I don't know how he would be different from the virtuous human being as he is described, right? And so I would try to think about the godlike human being as a kind of ideal that Aristotle knows that we can't accomplish, right? In which case becoming virtuous becomes more feasible. Second point, I think the stuff from book 7, chapter 5, which is on bestial vice, right? So like the guy who kills his mother and eats her hair, that kind of stuff, those tales he heard from something happened near the Red Sea. That's what the newspaper says this morning. And then he gives these weird tales about things that people do when they're overtaken by bestial vice. I think for Freud, we all have impulses in us towards those things. Like that's the right way to put Freud's empirical claim about the nature of the id. And that I think is an empirical claim. So the kinds of things that Aristotle describes there or even if you don't like his examples, you could pick other ones. They're fundamentally inappropriate. What I think makes something a bestial vice is that it's fundamentally inappropriate to the world. Like eating charcoal is just doesn't make sense, right? There's some kind of, and so I think for the question is whether we all have impulses like that. And I think that's just partly an empirical question. I don't know if that would destroy Aristotle to admit that there are impulses in human beings that are like that.
Paige.
In listening to what Neil was saying, the Aristotle got past me. But one thing struck me is this idea of civilization as something somewhat analogous. I'm thinking of the models of the human psyche that Freud offers throughout his career, and the unconscious, and then the unconscious, preconscious, and then consciousness, and then the gate, and all that's, it's as one model, and then ego, superego, id, different terms, but always somewhat analogous. And I got to thinking, is civilization itself analogous to the force of repression, that line in those models of the psyche? Does it work that way? And then, but of course, there's still that gate and things are slipping by. But I just, I'm trying to put things in terms of those diagrams that you learn when you're an undergraduate.
So the answer is I don't know. He does make a kind of comment at the end of this text about the possibility of having a neurotic culture or neurotic civilization. That is, that he'd be moving that word from the individual to the whole culture. And then the question is, well, what would that look like? Conceptually, it's not clear to me how that works. But I think it's right to think of civilization itself not only causing the superego in individuals, but being somehow like a superego over the culture or the community at large. I think that's the way he's thinking there. But yeah, I can't say more than that. To me, it's an intriguing concept. And then once you get clear conceptually on how the microcosm, macrocosm analogy would work and what its limitations were, then you can ask, what would a neurotic culture look like? But he doesn't really spell that out. He just mentions it in the last chapter.
Thank you.
I guess I'm going to jump back in on this conversation that Molly and Josh started about this reverential approach to texts and wrongness and what kind of approach that this encourages in our students and sort of what the stakes are, because I find this to be a really interesting and important question. And so I guess, and this is for Molly and Josh and everybody, I'm wide open here. We only have a few more minutes, so we needn't be too formal. But so I actually, and I think I've used this example in earlier core conversations. It's comes up, right, when people know that I do ancient philosophy. It comes up from some of my more political feminist students. How can you do that, right? How can you spend all your time with such misogynists? And one of my stock answers, and it is a stock answer, I'm going for the laugh, but it's and I think I've mentioned it before here, but it's, look, I think Aristotle gets a lot of things right about human beings. And one of the things he gets wrong is that I'm not entirely one. He's wrong. And in fact, pointing to his wrongness is a way for me to convey to them that we can still be sympathetic to this text. And I think, I'm not sure, it's not language that I tend to use. I'm not sure what all the content is to a reverential approach, but my guess is that my approach to Plato and Aristotle comes close to what you have in mind, Josh. But it's not that, because I also think that's, you know, some of the silliness. There's some silly claims in Aristotle, and sort of when they come up, it's not why I teach the text. I don't teach the text because there are wrong things in it or silly things in it. But the wrongness and the silliness doesn't inhibit my choosing those texts for my students, and naming it as wrongness and silliness, I don't think contributes to them becoming unsympathetic readers. In fact, I think it actually contributes to them becoming more sympathetic, perhaps reverential. And I think that I feel this way about Freud. I mean, he says wrong and silly things about really important questions, that he also gets a lot of things, perhaps, I don't know if he gets them right, but he says things that that warrant our attention and our consideration and our sympathy, and maybe does point us toward something true, good, beautiful. So for me, and again, I'm really interested in what you have to say. I agree that it's important to move students toward sympathy, maybe reverence, depending on what we mean by that. But I don't think that this question of wrongness and silliness in a text, and even highlighting it, it could not be a part of that goal.
Yeah. So the question is how big a part? Part of the point was, I mean, in part, you presented Molly's presentation as, well, you know, Freud's just kind of silly. And so part of my comments have something to do with just the strategy. So I am not suggesting, when I say that at my school, I have to get students to take books seriously. I mean, I think we all have a real challenge getting students to take difficult books seriously. So the strategy of choosing one that's maybe a little bit easier to read may not really even be the best thing the person wrote. You can see part of what I'm after is this question, whether are you trying to get what is best in a thinker, or are you really just looking at a particular text just as an occasion to have a conversation? In my experience at my university, it's pretty important to be as selective as you can be and to try to get the very best of a thinker. So even though one can raise objections about Aristotle, I don't think anyone would ever suggest that the lion's share of what Aristotle argues is silly. There are a lot of people who think Freud is really just silly. And I have to say, this of his texts makes him look even sillier. The late texts that were on group psychology stray from his only real strength, which is studying individual psychology. When he wandered into doing group psychology, he was being a little bit like Einstein. You know, Einstein talking about the human condition. He was really like beyond his bailiwick, and he should have stayed away from it. So you have to understand, that's why I'm asking the questions that I'm asking, because it looks like this is sort of hamstringing the author. But I can see, look, I understand Molly has she had very specific reasons for using the text. And I understand that. And that's part of why I framed it with reference to my own experience teaching where I teach. And I think we probably have a different kind of approach. So I know I said a lot of different things there. Sorry.
Well, I want to defend myself a little bit. I don't think that I'm choosing a text that is an author not at his strongest. I think we have a disagreement about where Freud is at his strongest. I find the stuff like on more precise psychoanalysis of individuals, I find that extraordinarily weak compared to this text. I find this text much more thoughtful. So I think I disagree there. But again, the thing I'm after here is, well, don't you think that it helps sometimes for students to realize they actually have to pay attention? Like it increases the quality of their attention to know that, like, every once in a while there's going to be something in the text that they really shouldn't believe. right?
Again, it's all a question of what you mean by every once in a while. It was simply the impression that you left that actually this was a text that has just a lot of bloopers. There's a lot of silliness here.
Well, I mean, I think they mostly show up in footnotes, and I don't know how much you think is a lot. You know, if there's like, you know, one thing per chapter that I think is the weak part of psychoanalysis showing up in what is otherwise really thoughtful reflection on human happiness and civilization, you know, then I can put up with the, you know, footnote 3 in chapter 3 on peeing on fire, you know. I think chapter 3 is really great, actually. And the footnote on how the homoerotic desire to pee on fire and how civilization entirely depends on you guys resisting that homoerotic desire to pee on fire, right? So that's, I think, a silly claim. It's in a footnote of what I take to be a really thoughtful chapter. And to me, it in no way undermines the quality of the text as something teachable. In fact, it kind of, to me, it augments it.
So I don't want to just keep on talking, but death instinct. I mean, the death instinct, that is probably the theory of Freud's that is most abandoned by Freudians. My father's a Freudian psychoanalyst. So I know of what I speak. They run away from that. There are very few who take it seriously. It's absolutely central to this text. For that reason, this would not be considered by Freudians to be a strong Freudian work. And I do think actually the earlier psychology, and I'm not necessarily talking about about particular cases, but I'm talking about the theories. I think some of those theories are actually worth considering. Anyway.
I think that there are parts of them that are worth considering, but I think that those are more salted with more, I think, silliness than this text is. And second of all, if I were after teaching this in, say, a psychology class, this would not be the right book to choose. But I'm not after teaching, the Freudian psychology. I'm after teaching them about a reflection on the structure of the human person and how it relates to your ability to get a good life and how that's going to mesh with civilization's demands. Right.
Let me get Peter in there, Molly, and you can respond to Peter and Josh, but we only have 5 minutes left, and I want to make sure that he gets his voice in here. But you'll get the last word, Molly, on whatever you want. But Peter, you're up.
So I was gonna actually, I'm inclined to side with Molly about the value of the text in a say core sequence for general education students or something like that. But on the broader question of teaching strategy, I mean, Josh, you had sort of alluded to the issue of context, right? That your student audience might be a little different from Molly's student audience or somebody else's. And I guess I find even at the level of particular texts, so the question of context really important in terms of how I would approach it. I teach at a very small Christian college with mostly evangelical students. And so I'm teaching the American founding. They know the founders are right about most stuff. And I have to work a little bit to get them to see, well, maybe there are problems and maybe the American Revolution wasn't even justified and so forth and so on, right? But Freud is somebody they just know is wrong. They've never read Freud. My students arrive here and he's one of 3 or 4 people, they know Freud is wrong. And so actually I just have to really, I present Freud right from the start and I say to them, look, I know you're going to see stuff here you think is crazy, but there's at least one thing in Freud that you as mostly evangelical Christians should agree with. He tells you don't understand yourself very well. And so I try to start them off by some books they need to be brought closer to and some books they need to be distanced from. But I think for all of us, it depends where we're coming from and where our students are coming from.
It's all you, Molly.
I have nothing else to say. I thank you for the conversation. Yeah, I think that Peter's right, that it's probably a different student context between my institution and Josh's, but also a different pedagogical goal. If I was teaching in a philosophy department or an undergraduate ethics class versus, a psychology program. So the question is it useful pedagogically, and what for and what situations?
Okay, well then I should not have interrupted 2 minutes ago because we have 4 minutes left. Does anybody have a final thing, or should we close it out? Okay, well, Molly, thank you so much. This was great, and thank you all for joining us. Again, this is the last core conversation of the year. And so I don't have another core conversation to promo for you, but we do have a conference coming up in a few weeks, and we would love to see you there. If you haven't, if you enjoyed today and this is your first core conversation, there are 7 others that are up, both the recorded remarks and the Q&As for all the other ones we've done this year are available on our website. And I think they turned out very well. So I recommend you check them out. Okay, so Molly, thanks again. Oh, you're muted.
Oh, thank you, Charlie, and thank you everyone for being here.
All right, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.